and welcome to Crowvane Manor. Wherever you are, and whatever kind of night it's been, you've come to the right place to slow down. Let the world go quiet for a while. Out here, none of it needs your attention. Many of you return to these rooms night after night, and I'm grateful for that. There's a reason you keep coming back. The stories kept inside these walls aren't quite like the ones you'll hear anywhere else. Before we begin, leave a comment and tell me where in the world you're listening from tonight. I always enjoy reading them. And if these stories stay with you, a like and a subscribe help more than you know. Now get comfortable, breathe slow, and let's open the door together. It was just a normal day, the kind that blends into every other routine day without anything special standing out. My girlfriend and I had taken my dog out for a walk along the same route we always used. It was something we did almost every day, a simple habit that gave us a chance to relax, talk, and let the dog burn off some energy. The neighborhood was quiet, familiar, and safe. At least that's how it had always felt to us. Nothing about that day suggested that anything unusual was about to happen. The weather was calm, not too cold, not too warm, just one of those comfortable days where everything feels steady and predictable. We walked side by side, talking casually about random things, while my dog moved slightly ahead of us, sniffing around and occasionally looking back to make sure we were still there. Everything felt normal in the way that makes you let your guard down without even realizing it. At some point during the walk, I noticed someone in the distance, walking toward us. It was an older woman, moving slowly, her head tilted down toward the ground as if she was watching her steps or maybe lost in thought. There was nothing immediately alarming about her at first glance. People passed each other all the time on this route. It was a normal thing, something that never really stood out. But as we got closer, something started to feel off. It wasn't anything I could clearly explain in the moment. It was more like a quiet instinct, a subtle sense that something wasn't quite right. My dog, who was usually relaxed and friendly around strangers, began to act differently. He slowed down, his body stiffened slightly, and he kept glancing toward the woman in a way that caught my attention. It wasn't his usual curiosity. It was something else, something closer to unease. I remember exchanging a quick look with my girlfriend. She hadn't said anything yet, but I could tell she felt it too. That strange, uncomfortable feeling that settles in your chest when something doesn't sit right, even if you can't explain why. Still, we kept walking. There was no reason not to. At least, that's what logic told us at the time. As we came within speaking distance, I did what I always do in situations like that. Out of simple politeness, I said, "Good morning." It was automatic, almost like a reflex. I didn't expect anything more than a small nod or maybe a quiet reply. For a moment, nothing happened. She kept her head down, and I thought maybe she hadn't heard me. But then, she slowly lifted her head and looked directly at me. That's when everything changed. The moment our eyes met, I felt something cold rush through my body. It wasn't just fear. It was something deeper, something that felt completely unnatural. Her eyes were completely black, not dark brown or shadowed in a way that could be explained by lighting. They were entirely black, like there was no white in them at all. No separation, no detail, just a solid, unnatural darkness filling where her eyes should have been. It didn't look human. That's the only way I can describe it. I've tried to rationalize it so many times since then, telling myself it must have been some kind of trick of the light or maybe a medical condition. But in that moment, there was no doubt in my mind. What I was looking at didn't feel normal in any sense. Before I could even process what I was seeing, she made a sound. A sharp, sudden hiss, like something you would expect from an animal, not a person. It wasn't loud, but it was clear, aggressive, and completely out of place. The kind of sound that instantly triggers your instincts, telling you to get away. My dog reacted immediately. His entire body tensed up, and he let out a low, uneasy sound, something I had never heard from him before. He wasn't barking or growling in a defensive way. It was more like confusion mixed with fear. He stepped back toward us, staying close as if he didn't want to be anywhere near her. I didn't say anything after that. I don't even remember thinking clearly in that moment. It was like my brain skipped straight to one simple command: leave. My girlfriend didn't need to say anything either. We both turned and started walking away as quickly as we could without breaking into a full run. There was a heavy silence between us as we moved away from her. I could feel my heart pounding, and I didn't dare look back at first. It felt like if I turned around, I might see something even worse. Eventually, after putting some distance between us, I glanced over my shoulder. She was still there, standing in the same spot, watching us. Even from a distance, there was something wrong about the way she stood. Completely still, like she wasn't just another person going about her day. It didn't feel like we had just passed someone on a normal walk. It felt like we had crossed paths with something that didn't belong. We didn't stop walking until we were far away from that area. Once we felt safe enough, we finally started talking about what had just happened. I asked my girlfriend if she had seen it too, if I was imagining things or overreacting. The way she looked at me told me everything I needed to know before she even spoke. She had seen it. The same thing. The same black, empty eyes. The same strange, unsettling feeling. We tried to make sense of it, but nothing we said felt convincing. We're both rational people. We don't jump to wild conclusions or believe in things without reason. We live normal lives, deal with everyday responsibilities, and approach things logically. That's what made this experience even harder to process. Over time, I started thinking about stories I had heard before. Stories about people with completely black eyes, often described in urban legends or strange encounters shared online. Most of those stories talk about children, which made this situation even stranger. This was an older woman, someone who should have looked ordinary, but nothing about her felt ordinary at all. I've gone over that moment in my head more times than I can count, trying to find a logical explanation, something that would make it less unsettling. Maybe it was some kind of rare eye condition. Maybe she was wearing something unusual. Maybe the lighting created an illusion. But no matter how I try to explain it, nothing quite fits. What stays with me the most isn't just what I saw, but how it felt. That deep, instinctive sense that something wasn't right. The way my dog reacted without hesitation. The way my girlfriend and I both felt the same unease without needing to say it out loud. It wasn't just visual. It was something you could feel. And the strangest part is that after that day, we never saw her again. Not once. We continued walking that same route for years after, at different times of the day and different seasons, but she never appeared again. It's like she was only there for that one moment, and then gone. It's been years now, and I still think about it from time to time, not in a constant, obsessive way, but in those quiet moments when your mind drifts back to things you never fully understood. I've experienced other scary or stressful situations in my life, things that had clear explanations or outcomes, but nothing has ever stayed with me in quite the same way as that encounter. Maybe she was just a person with something unusual about her, and we happened to catch her at a strange moment. That's the explanation I try to hold on to, but there's always that small part of me that isn't fully convinced. because whatever that was, it didn't feel normal. And even now, I can't say with any certainty what we actually saw that day. When I was a kid, I didn't really understand how complicated adults could be. At that age, your world is small and simple. Home is supposed to feel safe, familiar, and predictable, even if things aren't perfect. You don't question much, and when something feels off, you don't always have the words to explain it. You just feel it and carry on. Looking back now, I can see there were a lot of things in my childhood that weren't normal, but at the time, it was just life. My stepdad was one of those people who could change completely depending on his mood. When he was sober, he could be calm, even friendly at times. He would joke around, talk like everything was fine, and act like a regular person. But when he drank, or when he mixed alcohol with whatever else he was taking, it was like someone flipped a switch. His energy shifted in a way that made the whole house feel different. You didn't need to see him to know something was wrong. You could feel it in the air. That night is one of those memories that stuck with me, even though so many other moments from that time have faded or blurred together. I don't remember exactly what day it was or what we had done earlier. It wasn't a special day. It was just another evening that started out like any other. But something changed, and it changed fast. I remember noticing it in small ways at first. The way he was moving, the way he was talking, louder than usual, more aggressive, like he was trying to prove something to no one in particular. His words didn't always make sense, and he would repeat himself or jump from one thought to another without finishing anything. Even as a kid, I could tell he wasn't just drunk. There was something else mixed in there, something that made him more unpredictable. There was another man in the house that night, one of his friends. I didn't know him well, but I had seen him around before. He wasn't a stranger, but he wasn't someone I was close to either. He seemed normal enough, at least compared to my stepdad in that moment. I don't remember much about how the argument started, but I remember the tension building quickly. My stepdad started accusing him of things. His voice got sharper, louder, and more intense with every word. He kept saying that this guy had ripped him off somehow, that he had taken something or cheated him out of something. Then the accusations shifted. Suddenly he was talking about my mom, saying that his friend had been hitting on her behind his back. Even back then, I didn't know what was true and what wasn't. I still don't. It could have been something real that got blown out of proportion, or it could have been completely made up in his mind because of whatever he was on. The problem was, it didn't really matter in that moment. What mattered was how angry he was and how quickly things were escalating. The atmosphere in the house changed completely. It went from tense to dangerous in a matter of seconds. I remember feeling that shift, that sudden awareness that something bad was about to happen. It's a strange feeling, especially as a kid, when you realize the adults around you aren't in control anymore. The argument got louder, more aggressive, until it turned into shouting. The friend tried to defend himself at first, trying to explain or calm things down, but it didn't work. Nothing was getting through. My stepdad wasn't listening. He was too far gone, too caught up in whatever he believed was happening. Then, everything moved fast. At some point, my stepdad grabbed a wooden oar. I don't even remember exactly where it came from. It might have been leaning somewhere in the house or stored nearby. It wasn't something you would normally think twice about, just an object like any other. But in his hands, in that moment, it became something else entirely. The second he picked it up, the situation crossed the line. It wasn't just an argument anymore. It wasn't just shouting or accusations. It turned into something physical, something real, something that couldn't be taken back. His friend saw it too. You could see the realization hit him, the understanding that this wasn't just talk anymore. Whatever he had been trying to say before didn't matter now. His focus shifted to getting out of there. My stepdad charged at him without hesitation. Everything after that felt chaotic, like a blur of movement and noise. His friend backed away quickly, trying to put distance between them, while my stepdad swung the oar in a wild, uncontrolled way. He wasn't thinking clearly. He was just acting on pure anger. The friend turned and ran. My stepdad chased him out of the house, still holding the oar, still shouting. I remember hearing the sound of their footsteps moving away, the noise fading as they went out into the street. It all happened so fast that I didn't even have time to fully process what I was seeing. I stayed where I was, frozen for a moment, trying to understand what had just happened. My heart was racing, and there was this heavy silence in the house once they were gone. It felt wrong, like the space had been shaken and hadn't settled yet. I don't know how long they were gone. It felt like a long time, but it could have only been minutes. Time moves differently when you're scared or confused. Eventually, my stepdad came back. He was still angry, still agitated, but the immediate chaos had passed. The other man never came back. At the time, I didn't think too deeply about it. I was a kid, and kids have a way of moving on from things because they don't always understand the full weight of what they've seen. I didn't ask questions. I didn't know how to. It just became one of those things that happened, something I tucked away in the back of my mind. But as I got older, that memory started to feel different. We lived in a small town, the kind of place where people don't just disappear without someone noticing. You see the same faces over and over again. People talk. News travels fast. And yet after that night, I never saw that guy again. Not once. At first, I told myself that maybe he just left town. Maybe he decided it wasn't worth sticking around after something like that. That would make sense. If someone chased you down the street with a weapon, you probably wouldn't feel comfortable coming back. You'd want to get as far away as possible. That's the explanation I still try to hold on to. But there's always that uncertainty, that small part of my mind that wonders if there was more to it. I don't have any proof that something worse happened. There's no memory of anything beyond what I saw. But the fact that he was just gone, completely gone, in a place where people usually don't just vanish like that, makes it hard not to think about. I've gone over that night in my head many times, trying to piece together details, trying to remember if there was anything I missed. But the truth is, I only saw a small part of it. I saw the beginning, and then it moved out of sight. Whatever happened after that, I wasn't there to witness it. That's what makes it unsettling. As an adult, I understand things differently now. I understand how dangerous that situation really was, how quickly it could have turned into something far worse. I understand how substances can twist someone's thinking, how paranoia and anger can combine into something unpredictable. But understanding it doesn't make it feel any less strange. It's one of those memories that doesn't have a clear ending. There's no resolution, no confirmation of what happened after that moment. Just a sudden break, like a story that stops halfway through and never continues. I hope he just left. I really do. I hope he got out of that situation and decided not to come back. That's the version of the story that makes the most sense, the one that lets me put that memory to rest. But I can't say for sure. And that uncertainty is what makes it stay with me, even after all these years. A A few years ago, I was heading back to New Jersey after spending the day in New York City. I had driven into the city earlier to drop my daughter off at her home, and by the time I was finally starting my trip back, it was already late on a Sunday night. The city feels different at that hour. During the day, New York is loud, crowded, and full of energy. There are people everywhere, traffic on every street, and a constant sense of movement. Late at night, though, especially on a Sunday, things can feel surprisingly quiet in certain areas. The crowds thin out, businesses begin closing, and some subway stations take on a completely different atmosphere. I was tired after a long day and just wanted to get home. I made my way down into the subway station, bought my ticket, and waited for the train. There weren't many people around at that particular platform. A few scattered passengers stood nearby, but nothing unusual caught my attention. When the train finally arrived, I stepped inside one of the cars and found a seat near the door. The doors closed shortly afterward. At first, everything seemed completely normal. I settled into my seat and expected the train to pull away at any moment. Instead, it remained still. That wasn't unusual by itself. Subway trains occasionally sit at stations for a few extra minutes due to scheduling, delays, or operational reasons. I didn't think much about it. I looked around the mostly quiet train car and waited. A minute passed, then another. Then another. The train still hadn't moved. I glanced out the window toward the platform, wondering what the delay was. That's when I noticed people approaching. At first, it was only a few individuals walking down the platform. Then more appeared, and then more. Within moments, what had started as a handful of people became an enormous group moving together through the station. I've never counted them, obviously, but if I had to estimate, it felt like there were well over 100 people, maybe around 150 or so. The sheer size of the group immediately caught my attention. What made it even stranger was how similar they looked. Many of them were dressed in nearly identical styles of clothing. They weren't wearing uniforms exactly, but there was enough similarity that they appeared connected somehow. My first thought was that they must all belong to the same organization, event, or group. As they continued walking along the platform, however, I started feeling increasingly uneasy. The train car I was sitting in was mostly empty. Because of that, I felt extremely visible. As the group passed by, person after person seemed to glance directly toward the train, toward me. Maybe they were simply looking at the train. Maybe they were looking around the station. But from where I sat, it felt like every single one of them noticed me. I remember becoming very aware of how alone I was. Normally, being inside a subway car feels safe because there are other passengers around. That night was different. The platform outside was packed with people, while my section of the train felt nearly deserted. As the group continued moving past the windows, my anxiety started building. Some of the individuals looked directly into the train as they walked by. Others barely glanced over. But because I was already nervous, every look seemed threatening. Every stare felt more intense than it probably was. The longer the group kept coming, the more uncomfortable I became. It felt endless. One person after another. Then another. Then another. I remember thinking that surely this had to be the end of the group. Then dozens more would appear. At one point, several of the men near my train car slowed down as they passed. A couple of them appeared to reach toward the subway doors. Maybe they were joking around. Maybe they were simply touching the exterior of the train. Maybe they were checking something. I honestly have no idea. But from my perspective, inside the car, already feeling nervous, it looked as though they were trying to see if the doors would open. That moment sent my imagination into overdrive. My heart started pounding. I kept thinking, please don't let these doors open. The doors remained closed. The train remained still. and the group continued moving past. Looking back now, I can admit that fear probably amplified everything I was experiencing. When people are scared, their brains start searching for danger everywhere. Every movement seems suspicious. Every glance feels threatening. Every unknown situation becomes a possible problem. At the time, though, none of that mattered. I was genuinely frightened. I sat there trying to appear calm while internally imagining all kinds of worst-case scenarios. The station felt isolated. The train wasn't moving. The platform seemed filled with people. And I felt trapped inside that car with nowhere to go. The strange thing was that despite the train being ready to leave, it continued sitting at the station. The doors remained shut. No one entered my car. No one approached directly. The train simply waited. As the minutes passed, I began wondering why. Maybe there was a signal issue. Maybe another train was ahead of us. Maybe there was some operational delay. Those would have been the most logical explanations. But sitting there in that moment, fear made me think differently. I started convincing myself that someone working the train must have noticed what was happening. Maybe a conductor had seen me bored. Maybe they had seen the massive group approaching. Maybe they decided not to open the doors again. Maybe they were intentionally keeping the train secure until the crowd moved past. Was that actually what happened? I honestly don't know. I've never been able to prove it. I never spoke to the conductor. I never asked anyone from the transit authority. For all I know, the train was delayed for a completely unrelated reason. But sitting there that night, it certainly felt like someone was looking out for me. The longer the train stayed still, the more grateful I became that the doors remained shut. Eventually, the enormous group continued down the platform and disappeared from view. Little by little, the station started looking normal again. The overwhelming feeling of being surrounded began to fade. I remember finally taking a deep breath. My shoulders relaxed. The tension that had been building for several minutes slowly started easing away. The platform outside no longer felt threatening. The station looked quiet once again. A short time later, the train finally began moving. The familiar sound of the wheels rolling along the tracks felt like the greatest relief in the world. I don't think I've ever been happier to hear a subway train leave a station. As we pulled away, I watched the platform disappear into the distance. Only then did I realize how tightly I had been gripping my seat. The adrenaline was finally wearing off. For the rest of the ride, I kept replaying the experience in my head. Part of me wondered whether I had overreacted. After all, the group may have had nothing to do with me. They could have been returning from an event, a gathering, a concert, a sports game, or any number of completely harmless activities. The similar clothing might have meant absolutely nothing. The looks I interpreted as threatening could simply have been ordinary glances. Fear has a way of changing how we interpret situations. At the same time, I couldn't shake the feeling that something unusual had happened. Not necessarily because of the crowd itself, but because of the timing. The doors closed. The train remained in place. The group passed by. The doors stayed shut. And only after everything was over did the train finally leave. Whether that was coincidence or not, I still don't know. Maybe there was a simple operational reason behind the delay. Maybe a signal was red. Maybe another train was occupying the track ahead. Maybe maintenance crews were working somewhere farther down the line. Any of those explanations would make perfect sense. But sometimes, experiences aren't remembered because of what actually happened. They're remembered because of how they felt, and that night felt unforgettable. What I remember most clearly isn't the station or even the crowd. It's the feeling of sitting alone inside that subway car while an enormous group walked past outside. It's the feeling of uncertainty, the feeling of wondering whether I was completely safe or whether I was imagining danger where none existed. It's the relief I felt when the doors stayed closed and the train finally began moving. Even now, when I think about that night, I find myself smiling a little. Not because it was enjoyable. At the time, it was anything but enjoyable. But because I still remember the overwhelming sense of gratitude I felt as that train pulled away from the station. Whether it was pure coincidence, standard transit procedure, or a conductor who happened to notice a nervous passenger sitting alone in a nearly empty train car, I'll probably never know. What I do know is that on that late Sunday night, after dropping my daughter off and beginning the long trip back to New Jersey, I spent several tense minutes convinced that those closed subway doors were the best thing standing between me and a situation I wanted no part of. And when that train finally rolled out of the station, I silently thanked whoever was responsible for keeping it that way. To this day, whenever I think about public transportation in New York, I remember that night and the incredible sense of relief that came with hearing the train finally start moving. Maybe it was just another routine delay. Maybe it wasn't. Either way, at that moment, it felt like someone had my back. And for that, I still find myself wanting to say, "Empta, you're all right in my book." I used to work the front desk at a gym that had a full-sized indoor basketball court. It wasn't a huge luxury gym, but it was big enough to stay busy throughout most of the day. People came in before work, after work, and even late at night. The basketball court was one of the most popular parts of the building. There were always pickup games going on, people practicing jump shots, or groups of teenagers running around burning off energy. Because of that, hearing basketballs bouncing and sneakers squeaking across the polished floor became such a normal part of my day that I barely noticed it anymore. One night I was working the closing shift by myself. That wasn't unusual. The gym often had only one employee left during the final hour before closing. My job was pretty simple. Once closing time arrived, I had to make sure everyone left the building, lock the doors, clean up a few things, and then do a final walkthrough of the entire facility to make sure nobody had stayed behind. I had done this routine dozens of times before, maybe even hundreds. It was usually boring and predictable. Every now and then I would find someone taking an extra long shower in the locker room, or someone pretending not to hear the announcement that the gym was closing. Most of the time, though, everyone left without any problems. That particular night seemed completely normal. As closing time approached, I made the standard announcements over the speakers, letting everyone know the gym would be shutting down soon. People gradually packed up their things and headed toward the exit. The basketball players finished their game and walked out. The people on the treadmills stepped off and grabbed their bags. A few people were still lifting weights, but they eventually left as well. Within about 15 minutes, the building appeared completely empty. I locked the front doors and began my final inspection. The gym was surprisingly quiet once everyone was gone. During business hours, there was always noise somewhere. Music played through the speakers. Machines hummed. People talked. Weights clanged together. Basketballs bounced. But after closing, everything felt different. The silence almost seemed heavy. Still, I wasn't thinking about anything creepy. I was mostly thinking about finishing my shift and going home. I started in the cardio area. Rows of treadmills stood motionless under the dimmed lights. The screens were dark. Everything looked exactly as it should. Then I moved to the basketball court. The court was empty. I stepped inside and looked around carefully. No players, no bags, no basketballs left behind. The large room felt even bigger without people in it. The overhead lights reflected off the polished wooden floor, creating long stretches of empty space. Satisfied, I continued my inspection. Next came the weight area. Again, nobody. I walked between rows of machines and benches, checking corners and looking behind equipment. Sometimes people would sit somewhere scrolling through their phones and completely ignore closing announcements. Not tonight. Everything was empty. The last place I checked was the locker rooms. The men's locker room was always the most annoying part of the inspection because it had so many places someone could be hiding without meaning to. There were showers, changing stalls, bathroom stalls, and rows of lockers. I walked through the entire area, checking every section. Nothing, no voices, no movement, no running water, no signs of anyone at all. I remember actually feeling relieved because it meant I was almost done for the night. After finishing the locker room inspection, I started walking back toward the front of the building. That's when I heard it. At first it was just a single sound, a footstep, then another, then several more. Someone was running. The noise was coming directly from the basketball court. I stopped walking immediately. For a second I thought maybe I had imagined it. Then I heard it again. This time there was no mistaking it. Someone was definitely moving around on the court. I could hear shoes hitting the hardwood floor. Not only that, but I heard the unmistakable squeaking sound basketball shoes make when someone changes direction quickly. Anyone who has spent time around basketball courts knows that sound. It's sharp and distinctive. Once you hear it enough times, you recognize it instantly. Squeak, squeak, squeak. It sounded exactly like someone running drills. My first reaction wasn't fear. It was irritation. I had just spent several minutes checking the entire building. The idea that some teenager had somehow slipped past me and stayed inside after closing immediately annoyed me. I remember muttering something under my breath as I turned around. I started walking quickly toward the court. As I got closer, the sounds continued. Running, footsteps, the squeaking of sneakers against polished wood. The noises echoed throughout the quiet building. At that point, I was convinced someone was in there. There was no doubt in my mind. I was already preparing what I was going to say. Something along the lines of, "The gym is closed. You need to leave right now." The closer I got, the angrier I became. I had stayed late enough already and didn't want to waste more time dealing with someone who thought the rules didn't apply to them. The entrance to the basketball court was only a few steps away. The sounds were still happening. I could practically pinpoint where the person seemed to be running. Then, just as I reached the doorway, everything stopped. Instantly, not gradually, not like someone slowing down. 1 second there were footsteps and squeaking shoes. The next second there was complete silence. I paused. The sudden change felt wrong. It was like someone had flipped a switch. Still expecting to catch whoever was making the noise, I stepped through the entrance. The court was empty, completely empty. I looked across the entire floor. Nobody, no players, no kids, no adults, no movement anywhere. I checked the benches. Nothing. I checked the corners. Nothing. I looked behind the divider curtains. Nothing. The massive room was completely deserted. I just stood there, staring. For several seconds, my brain refused to process what I was seeing. I knew what I had heard. The sounds had been clear, loud, close. There was absolutely no way I could have mistaken them. It hadn't sounded distant. It hadn't sounded like a television. It hadn't sounded like plumbing or machinery. It sounded exactly like a person running on the court. Yet there was no one there. The silence felt different now. Before, the empty gym had simply been quiet. Now, it felt wrong. I can't really explain it any better than that. Every hair on my arm stood up. A strange feeling settled in my stomach. Suddenly, I became very aware that I was alone in a giant building at night. I remember slowly turning in a circle, scanning every inch of the court. Nothing moved. Nothing made a sound. The lights reflected off the polished floor exactly as they had earlier. The room looked completely normal. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. My annoyance disappeared instantly. It was replaced by pure fear. The rational part of my brain tried to come up with explanations. Maybe the sound came from somewhere else. Maybe it echoed strangely through the building. Maybe I was more tired than I realized. Maybe someone had somehow slipped out before I entered. But none of those explanations made sense. The noise had sounded too close, too clear, too specific. I knew what running shoes on a basketball court sounded like because I heard them every day. This was exactly that sound, and it had stopped the moment I arrived. That realization hit me harder than anything else. The timing felt impossible. I stood there for another few moments before deciding I had absolutely no interest in staying any longer. Normally, after finishing the walkthrough, I still had a few closing tasks left to complete. There was paperwork to finish, some lights to check, and a couple of small things that had to be done before leaving. That night, I didn't care. I turned around and headed straight for the front of the building. Then I walked faster. Then, even faster. By the time I reached the lobby, I was practically jogging. I grabbed my things, made sure the building was secured, and got out of there as quickly as possible. Honestly, I don't even remember whether I completed every closing responsibility that night. I just wanted to leave. The moment I got into my car, I locked the doors immediately. I sat there for a minute, trying to calm down before finally driving home. For the rest of the night, I kept replaying the experience in my head. The sounds, the timing, the empty court. None of it made sense. Over the next few days, I asked a few coworkers if they had ever experienced anything strange in the building. Most laughed it off. A couple mentioned hearing weird noises late at night, but gyms are full of sounds. Air systems turn on and off. Metal equipment settles. Pipes make noises. Nothing they described matched what I had heard. I continued working there for quite a while afterward. The strange thing is that it never happened again. Not once. I worked many more closing shifts. I walked through that same basketball court countless times after dark. Every inspection was completely normal. No mysterious footsteps, no squeaking shoes, no sounds of someone running around after the building was empty. Just silence. Part of me wishes it had happened again, because maybe then I could have figured out what caused it. Maybe there was a perfectly logical explanation. Maybe there was some acoustic effect in the building that created the illusion. Maybe I simply misunderstood what I heard. But another part of me is glad it never happened again, because I'm not sure I wanted to experience that feeling twice. Even now, years later, I can still remember it clearly. Out of all the strange things that happened during my time working at that gym, that moment stands out the most. It wasn't because I saw something impossible. It wasn't because I encountered a ghost or witnessed some dramatic supernatural event. It was because of how real it sounded. For those few moments, I was completely certain that another person was on that basketball court. I would have bet money on it. The footsteps were unmistakable. The squeaking shoes were unmistakable. Everything about it sounded exactly like someone running back and forth across the hardwood floor. And then I walked into the room and found absolutely nobody there. That image has stayed with me ever since. Whenever I think about empty buildings at night, I remember that silent basketball court and the sounds that came from it. I remember standing in the doorway, expecting to find some kid hiding after closing, only to discover a completely deserted room. I still don't know what caused it. Maybe there's a reasonable explanation that I never figured out. Maybe there isn't. All I know is that it remains one of the few experiences in my life that I genuinely cannot explain. And even now, thinking about those footsteps echoing through an empty gym is enough to send a chill down my spine. I grew up on an old farm in Texas, the kind of place that had been in the family for generations and carried that feeling with it everywhere. It wasn't just a house on a piece of land. It felt like something that had absorbed years of people living, working, arguing, laughing, grieving, and dying around it. When a place has belonged to one family for that long, you can feel the weight of it, even as a child. The walls don't feel empty. The rooms don't feel like they begin and end with whoever is living there at the moment. They feel layered, like every generation left something behind, even if no one talks about it. As a kid, I didn't have the words for that, but I could feel it. I could feel when a room was just a room, and I could feel when a room had something else sitting in it. The fireplace was in the den, and it had those old smoke-stained glass doors on the front. Because we lived in Texas, we almost never used it. It wasn't like some northern home where the fireplace was burning every night through the winter. For us, it was more of a seasonal thing, maybe once or twice a year around winter holidays, when it finally got cold enough, or when the adults wanted the house to feel cozy. Most of the year, it just sat there, dark and unused, with those glass doors shut. The glass was never fully clean. It had that cloudy gray-brown staining from smoke, the kind that makes reflections look distorted and makes whatever is behind it hard to see clearly. It wasn't like a regular mirror, but when the light hit it a certain way, you could see shapes and shadows in it, and it always felt like it could hide something. I was about 6 years old when I first started feeling it. Not seeing it. At least, not yet. Feeling it. I know people brush that off when it comes from a child, but kids can be very honest about what their bodies tell them. I didn't make up some big story right away. I didn't create a whole monster with a name and a backstory. I just knew there was someone in the fireplace. That was the thought that kept coming to me again and again. Not something, but someone. And that someone was looking out through the glass. It's hard to explain the feeling of being watched when there isn't an obvious person in the room. It starts as discomfort, like you're suddenly aware of your own skin. Then your shoulders tighten. The hair on the back of your neck rises. You get goosebumps for no reason. Your body acts like there are eyes on you before your mind can prove it. Every time I was near that fireplace, I felt that. It was like the glass had a tension behind it. Like someone was sitting in the dark on the other side, staring out into the den, waiting for me to notice them. I could be playing or walking through the room or just standing there. And suddenly, I'd feel that pressure. My stomach would twist, my neck would prickle, and I'd know without looking that the fireplace was watching me. I told my parents over and over. I told them there was someone in the fireplace. I said it plainly because I believed it completely. I wasn't trying to scare them or get attention. I wanted help. I wanted them to understand that the den did not feel safe to me because that fireplace was not empty. But adults have a way of making a child's fear smaller than it feels to the child. They brushed it off. They told me to pray. That was their answer. Pray about it. Don't be scared. Stop being dramatic. That kind of thing. I don't know if they truly thought I was imagining it or if they just didn't want to deal with the idea that something could be wrong in a house that had been part of the family for so long. Either way, the answer was always the same. They didn't believe me in the way I needed to be believed. So I learned to avoid looking at the fireplace doors. That became my rule. I could be in the den if I had to, but I would not look straight at the glass. I would keep my eyes on the floor, on the TV, on a toy, on anything else. If I had to walk past it, I would feel that cold, prickly stare coming from the glass, and I would move faster, but I still wouldn't look. Because deep down, I knew something in a way only children know things. I knew that if I looked, I would see who was in there. Not might see. Would see. And that was worse than feeling watched. As long as I didn't look, it could stay hidden in that awful maybe place. It could be a feeling, a pressure, a fear. But if I looked and saw it, then it would become real in a way I couldn't undo. For a while, that was how I survived it. I stayed away as much as possible. I turned my head when I passed. I sat where I couldn't see the fireplace directly. I pretended to focus on other things while feeling that stare crawl over me. The den should have been one of the normal family spaces in the house, but for me it always had that dark center. The fireplace sat there like a closed mouth, and behind the smoke-stained glass I felt that someone waiting. Then, one night, for reasons I still don't fully understand, I decided to face my fear. Maybe I was tired of being scared. Maybe I was trying to prove to myself that my parents were right and there was nothing there. Maybe I was angry that nobody believed me. Maybe I wanted control over the feeling instead of letting it control me every time I entered the room. Whatever the reason, I remember making that choice. I remember being in the den and feeling that presence again. That familiar stare pressing out from the fireplace. My body did the usual things. Goosebumps, tight throat, hair standing up on the back of my neck. The urge to look away was strong. It felt almost physical, like something was telling me not to. But this time, I looked. I turned my eyes straight to the glass doors, and what I saw behind them is something I can still see clearly even now. There was a small child behind the glass, not a shadow that kind of looked like a child, not a reflection of myself twisted by the smoke stains. A child. Small, curled up inside the fireplace, with their knees pulled to their chest. Their skin was blue and ashen, the color of coldness and death, like all the warmth had been drained out of them long ago. Their eyes were sunken, dark in a way that made the face look hollow and old, even though the body was small. They looked miserable, trapped and frozen. Not evil, not angry, not like a monster from a cartoon. They looked like a child who had been left somewhere too cold for too long. The thing that made it worse was that they were breathing. I could see little cold puffs of air coming from them, like breath on a freezing winter day. That made no sense. We were in Texas. The fireplace wasn't being used. There shouldn't have been cold air inside it, not like that. But the puffs came out slow and visible, each one fading into the small, dark space behind the glass. The child was shivering too. Their whole body had that tight, trembling posture, knees tucked in, arms close, shoulders hunched. They looked freezing. They looked trapped behind those smoke-stained doors, sitting in the place where fire should have been, giving off cold instead of heat. I froze. I don't mean I stood still because I decided not to move. I mean my body stopped working. I couldn't scream. I couldn't run. I couldn't even blink the way I wanted to. The den around me seemed to fall away until there was only me and that child behind the glass. The air felt different, too. I could feel a chill creeping up, not like normal air conditioning or a draft, but like cold fingers moving through the room toward me. It started at the edges of my body, crawling over my skin, making the goosebumps sharper. The longer I stared, the colder I felt. It was like the cold was coming from the fireplace, from that child, pushing through the glass even though the doors were closed. Then the child moved. Slowly they put one hand on the glass. That small hand pressed against the inside of the door, and I remember the horror of that gesture more than almost anything else. It wasn't just scary because it moved. It was scary because it felt like a request. Like the child wanted something from me. Like they knew I was finally looking, and now they had a chance. I stared at that little hand against the glass and felt very clearly the urge to open the doors. I don't mean I decided to open them. I mean the urge appeared in me like it had been placed there. A pull. A suggestion. A pressure in my mind and body that said, open it. Open the doors. Let the child out. It felt gentle and terrible at the same time. Gentle because the child looked so cold and miserable, like any human being would want to help. Terrible because every instinct in me also knew I should not open those doors. There was something wrong about the request, something deeper than fear. It was the feeling that if I opened them, I would be crossing a line I could never uncross. I didn't know what would happen. I didn't know if the child would come out, or if something else would, or if the room would change forever. I just knew the urge was strong, and that made it dangerous. I was still frozen there, caught between terror and that awful pull toward the fireplace, when one of my siblings came screaming into the den. That scream broke whatever hold the moment had on me. It snapped the room back into normal shape. Sound came back. The house came back. My body came back. I don't even remember exactly why my sibling was screaming or what happened right after. What I remember is that the interruption saved me from staying locked in that stare any longer. I never moved toward the fireplace. I never opened the doors. The child was there, and then the moment broke, and after that I never outright saw the fireplace child again. But not seeing them didn't mean they were gone. The feeling stayed. Every time I was around that fireplace, I could still feel that stare coming from behind the glass. I still felt watched. I still felt that same urge sometimes, the quiet pull to open the doors, like there was a tiny, cold presence tucked behind them waiting for me to give in. I avoided it more than ever after that. I didn't need to test myself again. Facing my fear had not made it smaller. It had given the fear a face. No one believed me. That might have been one of the loneliest parts of it, honestly, when you're a child and you see something like that. You need someone older and stronger to tell you they understand, that they'll protect you, that what you saw matters. Instead, I was told I was being dramatic. I was told to pray. I was brushed aside like I had invented the whole thing for attention. And the more they dismissed it, the more alone I felt with the memory. Because how do you explain to adults that you know what you saw? How do you explain that it wasn't a dream or a shadow or your imagination? Because you still feel the cold and you still remember the hand pressing against the glass? The face never left me. Even now, I can see it clearly. The blue ashen skin, the sunken eyes, the small body folded in on itself, the cold breath puffing out in the dark, the hand on the glass. That image lives in my head with a kind of sharpness that real fear leaves behind. Childhood memories fade all the time, but this one never did. It stayed clear, almost too clear, like the fireplace child wanted to make sure I would never fully forget them. I've seen other strange, ghost-like things many times since then. Things I couldn't explain, and things that made me believe there is more around us than most people want to admit. But this was my first. This was the first time the world opened a crack and showed me something that didn't belong in the ordinary rules of life. Maybe that's why it affected me so deeply. It happened when I was young enough to still believe adults knew everything. but old enough to understand when adults were wrong. I knew they were wrong about the fireplace. I knew there was someone in there long before I looked. And when I finally did look, I saw exactly what I had always feared I would see. Living on that old family farm meant living with history, with generations, with stories people told and probably many more they didn't. I don't know who that child was. I don't know if they were tied to the land, the house, the fireplace, or something older than all of us. I don't know if they were truly a child or something wearing the shape of one, because that shape would make me want to help. That question bothers me sometimes, because the sadness of the child was so strong, but so was the wrongness. They looked like they needed warmth, but the cold that came from them felt unnatural. They looked like they wanted out, but the urge to open the doors felt like a trap. And that is what still scares me most. Not just that I saw a ghostly child in the fireplace, but that I wanted, for a moment, to open the glass. That some part of me was pulled toward doing it. I think about how small I was, how easily I could have reached forward if my fear hadn't frozen me, how close that moment felt to becoming something else. If my sibling hadn't burst into the room screaming, I don't know how long I would have stood there. I don't know if the urge would have gotten stronger. I don't know if I would have moved. I never saw the child clearly again, but I never stopped feeling them when I was near that fireplace. The smoke-stained glass always seemed darker than it should have been. The doors always felt like they were holding something back. And even after years passed, even after I got older and saw other strange things, nothing ever replaced that first image of the small blue child curled behind the glass, shivering in the dark where fire was supposed to live, staring out at me like they had been waiting for the day I finally looked back. Forgive me for stepping in for just a moment. If you've only recently found your way here, then welcome. I'm glad you came. If these stories are keeping you company tonight, consider subscribing to Crowvane Manor. New stories arrive here often, the kind that stay with you long after the night is over. And if you tap the bell, you won't have to go looking. The next one will find you on its own. Thank you for being here. Now, let's return to where we left off. Years ago, I worked for a company that handled foreclosed properties. My job involved visiting houses that had been abandoned, repossessed by banks, or left sitting empty for long periods of time. Most of the homes were in rough condition. Some had been vacant for months, while others looked like people had left in a hurry and never returned. It wasn't exactly a glamorous job, but it paid the bills. Over time, I got used to seeing things that would make most people uncomfortable. I walked through houses filled with garbage, broken furniture, graffiti, and signs of drug use. Some places looked like they had been turned into makeshift shelters. Others were so damaged that it was hard to believe anyone had ever lived there. After a while, very little surprised me anymore. Still, there was one house that I have never been able to forget. Even now, years later, thinking about it gives me chills. One morning, a coworker and I were assigned to inspect a foreclosed property on the edge of town. We had a list of places to visit that day, and this house was just one stop among many. Neither of us knew anything special about it before arriving. As far as we were concerned, it was another abandoned property that needed to be documented and inspected. The neighborhood itself wasn't particularly nice, but it wasn't the worst area we had worked in either. The house sat back from the road behind an overgrown yard. Tall weeds covered most of the property, and several windows appeared damaged. The place looked neglected, like it had been forgotten by everyone around it. As soon as I stepped out of the truck, something felt wrong. I know that sounds dramatic, but it's the best way I can describe it. Usually when we arrived at a property, I would immediately start thinking about the work ahead. I'd grab my equipment, look over the exterior, and begin the inspection. At this house, though, I barely noticed any of that. The moment my feet touched the ground, a strange feeling settled over me. It felt like someone was watching me. Not the normal kind of feeling you get when you're in an unfamiliar neighborhood. This felt different. It was strong enough that I instinctively turned around and looked behind me. Nobody was there. The street was quiet. There were no people outside. No movement. Nothing unusual at all. Yet the feeling remained. My coworker didn't say anything, so I assumed it was just my imagination. We had been working long hours, and maybe I was simply tired. Trying to ignore it, I followed him toward the front door. The closer we got to the house, the stronger the feeling became. I remember looking at the dark windows and getting the uncomfortable sensation that someone was standing behind them, staring out at us. Again, when I actually looked closely, there was nothing there. Just darkness inside an abandoned house. We unlocked the door and stepped inside. Immediately, the atmosphere felt heavy. The air smelled stale and damp. Dust covered almost every surface. Pieces of trash were scattered across the floors. Judging by the condition of the property, people had likely been coming and going for quite some time after it was abandoned. Unfortunately, that wasn't uncommon. A lot of the houses we inspected had become gathering places for drug users, squatters, or trespassers. Normally, that possibility would have been my biggest concern. That day, however, something else had my attention. The feeling of being watched had followed me inside. Every room we entered felt wrong. I can't explain it any better than that. The house wasn't particularly large, but every space seemed strangely oppressive. It felt as if someone was standing just outside my field of vision wherever I went. As we began documenting the condition of the property, I started noticing something strange. At first, I thought it was just a trick of the light. Out of the corner of my eye, I would catch movement. Not clear movement, just something dark. A shape, a shadow. Whenever I turned my head to look directly at it, nothing was there. The first time it happened, I ignored it. The second time, I felt uneasy. By the fifth or sixth time, I couldn't stop thinking about it. In nearly every room, I thought I saw the same thing. A dark shape lingering near a corner. Not standing still exactly. Almost swirling, like smoke gathering into a shadow. The moment I looked directly at it, it disappeared. Every single time. I tried convincing myself there had to be a logical explanation. The house was dark. Many of the windows were covered. Light was coming through at odd angles. Dust floated through the air. Maybe my eyes were playing tricks on me. Maybe my brain was turning ordinary shadows into something unsettling because of the strange feeling I'd had since arriving. That explanation made sense. At least it should have. The problem was that the shadows kept appearing. Every room, every hallway. Every time I thought I caught sight of one, it seemed to be standing in a corner just outside my direct vision. Then it would vanish. The longer we stayed inside, the more uncomfortable I became. I found myself constantly looking over my shoulder. I kept checking behind doorways. I kept glancing toward corners. It got to the point where I was spending more time watching the room around me than focusing on my actual job. My coworker seemed unusually quiet, too. Normally, we'd spend inspections talking, joking around, or complaining about the condition of the houses. That day, there wasn't much conversation. The silence felt strange. At one point, we entered what appeared to be a living room near the back of the house. The feeling there was especially intense. I remember standing in the middle of the room while my coworker examined a wall. Once again, I caught sight of a dark, swirling shape in the corner. I quickly turned my head toward it. Nothing. The corner was empty. Just peeling paint and shadows. I took a deep breath and told myself to stop being paranoid. Then, without warning, a loud crash echoed through the house. Both of us jumped. The sound was powerful enough to vibrate through the floor. For a second, neither of us moved. Then came the realization of what we had heard. The basement door had slammed shut. Not creaked, not moved slightly. It had slammed. Hard, the sound echoed throughout the entire house. My heart immediately started racing. I looked at my coworker. He looked at me. Neither of us spoke for a moment. The house had been completely still only seconds earlier. There was no strong wind, no open windows creating a draft, nothing that should have caused such a violent slam. I remember staring toward the hallway where the basement entrance was located. Part of me expected to hear footsteps. Part of me expected someone to come walking out. Nothing happened. The house fell silent again. That silence somehow felt worse than the noise. Finally, my coworker broke the tension. He simply looked at me and said something along the lines of, "Yeah, I think we're done here." I didn't argue, not even for a second. At that point, I wanted nothing more than to leave. We gathered our things and started heading toward the front door. As we moved through the house, I continued catching glimpses of those dark shapes at the edges of my vision. Every time I turned toward them, they were gone. Maybe it was my imagination. Maybe fear was affecting what I thought I saw. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something in that house didn't want us there. The walk back outside felt much longer than it should have. When we finally stepped through the front door and into the daylight, I immediately felt relief. It was as if a weight had been lifted from my shoulders. The strange pressure that had followed me throughout the house seemed to lessen the moment I left. Neither of us said much while walking back to the truck. I think we were both trying to process what had just happened. For several moments, the only sound was our footsteps crunching through the overgrown yard. Eventually, curiosity got the better of me. I turned toward my coworker. Trying to sound casual, I asked if the house had felt strange to him. I wasn't expecting much. Honestly, I thought he'd probably laugh and tell me I was imagining things. Instead, he stopped walking. He looked at me for a second before answering. Then he said something that instantly sent chills through my entire body. He said, "Yeah, I kept seeing black shadows in the corners." For a moment, I just stared at him. I hadn't mentioned the shadows, not once. The entire time we had been inside, I kept my observations to myself because I assumed they were products of my own imagination. Yet he had experienced the exact same thing. Not just a general feeling of unease, not just nervousness. The same shadows, the same corners, the same dark shapes that seemed to disappear whenever you looked directly at them. I remember feeling every hair on my arms stand up. Suddenly, all the explanations I had been telling myself felt less convincing. Maybe there was still a rational answer. Maybe the lighting inside the house created similar visual illusions for both of us. Maybe the environment influenced our perceptions. Maybe there was a perfectly ordinary reason. But at that moment, standing beside the truck, neither of us had an explanation. All we knew was that we had both experienced something unsettling inside that house. The drive away from the property was unusually quiet. Neither of us seemed eager to discuss it further. Part of me didn't even want to think about it. I just wanted to put distance between myself and that place. Over the following days, I couldn't stop replaying the experience in my head. The feeling of being watched, the strange atmosphere, the dark shapes appearing in room after room, the basement door slamming shut, and most of all, my coworker describing the same shadows without any prompting from me. That was the part that stayed with me. I've worked in countless abandoned buildings throughout my life. I've been in dangerous neighborhoods, vacant properties, and places that looked like scenes from horror movies. Most of them never bothered me. They were just empty buildings. But that house was different. Whether there was a logical explanation or not, something about it felt deeply wrong from the moment I arrived. Eventually, another inspection at that property was scheduled. When I saw the address, I immediately declined. I didn't care if it made me look foolish. I didn't care if people thought I was overreacting. I had no intention of going back. Someone else could handle it. I had spent enough time in that house. To this day, I still don't know what happened there. Maybe everything had a perfectly reasonable explanation. Maybe the shadows were tricks of the eye. Maybe the door slammed because of air pressure. Maybe the feeling of being watched was simply anxiety. It's possible. But even now, years later, whenever I think back to that property, I remember the overwhelming sense that something unseen was following us from room to room. I remember those dark shapes lingering in the corners of my vision. Most of all, I remember the chills that ran through me when my coworker described seeing the exact same thing. Whatever was going on inside that abandoned house, I knew one thing for certain. I was never going back. This happened when my family had recently moved into a new house. The neighborhood was part of a fairly typical township development. Rows of homes lined the streets, and many of the houses looked almost identical from the outside. It was the kind of place where you could easily mistake one house for another if you weren't paying attention. We hadn't lived there very long, so I was still getting used to the layout of the house and all the little sounds that come with living somewhere new. Every home has its own personality when it comes to noises. Floors creak differently. Doors settle differently. Pipes make different sounds. And it takes a while before your brain learns what is normal and what isn't. I've always been a night owl, so staying up late wasn't unusual for me. Even back then, midnight was considered early by my standards. Most nights, I wouldn't even think about going to bed until around 12:30 or later. Because of that, I was completely awake and alert during the event I'm about to describe. This wasn't one of those situations where I had just woken up from a dream or was half asleep and confused. I was fully conscious and doing exactly what I normally did late at night. One evening, around 11 o'clock, I found myself getting hungry. The kitchen was downstairs, and I was standing near the top of the staircase, trying to decide whether it was worth making the trip for a snack. Looking back, it's funny that I spent so much time debating something so simple, but I was comfortable where I was and feeling lazy. The house was completely quiet. Everyone else had already settled in for the night. No televisions were on. No conversations were happening. The entire place felt still, because the hallway lighting wasn't particularly bright. I had my phone out and was using the flashlight. The beam shined directly down the staircase, illuminating the steps all the way to the bottom. I remember this detail very clearly because it became important later. I wasn't standing in darkness. I had a clear view of the stairs. The flashlight beam reached all the way down to the first floor. For several moments, I simply stood there thinking about food and deciding whether I wanted to make the effort to go downstairs. Then everything changed. Without any warning, I heard two incredibly loud footsteps at the base of the staircase. They weren't subtle sounds. They weren't creaks. They weren't settling noises from the house. These sounded exactly like heavy footsteps landing on the floor. Thump, thump. The suddenness of the noise immediately grabbed my attention. Before I could even process what I was hearing, something else happened. A rapid series of heavy stomps exploded up the staircase. The sound was unbelievably fast. I've heard people run upstairs before. I've heard kids sprinting through houses. I've heard dogs charging up staircases. This was faster than anything I had ever heard in that house, and honestly faster than almost anything I had ever heard in my life. The footsteps raced upward with incredible speed. Thump, 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 thump. Each impact sounded heavy. Powerful, intentional. The sound wasn't coming from somewhere else in the neighborhood. It wasn't faint or distant. It was right there on my staircase, coming directly toward me. I froze. For a split second, my brain assumed someone was physically running up the stairs. The problem was that I couldn't see anyone. My flashlight was shining directly down the staircase. The steps were illuminated. The staircase was completely empty. Yet, the sounds continued charging upward. What happened next is the part that has stayed with me all these years. As the footsteps raced toward the top, I actually saw movement. Not a person, not a figure, nothing clearly visible. But I saw several steps bow downward slightly as though weight was landing on them. One after another. The wood flexed, only a little, but enough that I noticed it. Enough that it looked exactly like something heavy was moving up the staircase, something I couldn't see. My heart immediately started pounding. The footsteps were almost at the top now. Every instinct in my body screamed that something was rushing directly toward me. I remember gripping my phone so tightly my hand hurt afterward. The stomping grew louder. Closer, closer. Then it reached the top, or at least that's where the sounds stopped. The final footsteps ended right in front of me, at the exact position where I was standing. And in that same instant, I felt something. A rush of air brushed past my face. It wasn't a gentle breeze. It felt like the air displacement created when something moves quickly nearby. The sensation lasted only a moment. But it was enough to make me instinctively flinch. The strange thing is that it didn't feel as though whatever was moving had stopped in front of me. It almost felt like it passed me. The footsteps ended at the top of the stairs, but the sensation gave me the impression that something had rushed right by and continued onward. Of course, there was still nothing there. No person, no animal, nothing visible at all. The staircase remained empty. The hallway remained empty. The entire house remained silent. For several seconds, I couldn't move. I just stood there staring down the stairs with my phone flashlight. My heart was racing so hard that I could hear it. I kept expecting something else to happen. Another noise. Another set of footsteps. Anything, instead, the silence returned. It was as if the entire event had never happened. Eventually, I managed to back away from the staircase. Needless to say, my plans of getting a snack disappeared immediately. The kitchen could wait. Whatever hunger I had felt a few minutes earlier was completely gone. I stayed upstairs for the rest of the night. Even though I tried to convince myself there had to be a reasonable explanation, nothing I came up with made sense. The next morning, I started asking questions. I figured maybe someone else in the house had heard something. Perhaps a family member had gotten up during the night. Maybe somebody had dropped something. Maybe there was some explanation I hadn't considered. So I asked around. Nobody had heard anything. Nobody had been awake. Nobody had been moving around the house. The event seemed to exist only in my experience. That wasn't entirely unusual, but it was frustrating. I wanted answers. Instead, I had questions. Later, I explained everything to my dad. He listened patiently and then offered what seemed like a logical explanation. The houses in our neighborhood shared certain structural similarities. Sound could travel in strange ways between units. He suggested that maybe one of the neighbors had caused the noise. Perhaps a kid had run up their stairs really fast. Maybe a dog had charged upstairs. Maybe the sound had traveled through the walls in a way that made it seem like it was happening inside our house. The theory sounded reasonable enough. In fact, I was happy to accept it. A normal explanation is usually preferable to an unexplained one. For a while, I felt satisfied. The mystery seemed solved. Then the next afternoon happened. I was outside in the backyard with our bulldog, waiting for him to finish doing his business. The weather was nice, and I found myself casually looking around at the neighboring houses. At some point, I happened to glance through the glass sliding door of the house directly next to ours. From that angle, I could see part of the interior. More specifically, I could see the staircase. Immediately, something caught my attention. The stairs weren't mirrored. They matched ours exactly. I remember standing there for a moment as the realization slowly sank in. Our staircase was positioned on the left side of the house when viewed from the back. Theirs was too. The layout was identical, not reversed, not mirrored. Identical, that detail mattered because it weakened the explanation I had accepted. If the sound had come from the neighboring staircase, it shouldn't have lined up the way I originally imagined. The more I thought about it, the less convinced I became. Then, another detail came back to me. The neighbors didn't even have a dog. They had one child, an older middle school-aged kid. No large pets, no energetic puppy running around, no obvious source for the kind of rapid, heavy stomping I had heard. Standing there in the backyard, I felt the uncomfortable mystery return. The explanation I had happily accepted suddenly didn't seem quite as solid. Maybe there was another neighbor farther away. Maybe sound traveled through multiple homes. Maybe there was still a perfectly ordinary explanation. I honestly don't know. What I do know is that nothing about that night felt ordinary. I was fully awake. I wasn't dreaming. I wasn't half asleep. I had a clear line of sight down the staircase. My flashlight illuminated the steps. I heard loud footsteps begin at the bottom. I heard them race upward. I saw steps flex slightly, as though something heavy was landing on them, and I felt air rush past my face when the sounds reached the top. To this day, I can't confidently explain any of it. I've replayed the event in my mind countless times over the years. Every so often, I'll think I've found a rational explanation. Then I'll remember another detail that doesn't quite fit. That's what makes the experience stick with me. Not because I immediately concluded it was something supernatural, but because it remains one of the few events in my life that I genuinely cannot explain. If it was some kind of animal, it was the fastest invisible animal I've ever encountered. If it was a dog, then it was an incredibly rude dog that somehow managed to sprint through my house without being seen. And if it was something else entirely, then I'm perfectly happy that whatever it was never decided to introduce itself properly. Fortunately, nothing similar ever happened again. I never heard another set of invisible footsteps charging up the stairs. I never saw the steps bend under unseen weight. I never felt that strange rush of air a second time. But even now, years later, I can still picture the flashlight beam shining down those empty stairs, while something unseen seemed to race directly toward me. Maybe there's a logical explanation waiting to be discovered. Maybe there isn't. All I know is that for a few unforgettable seconds at 11 o'clock on an otherwise ordinary night, something appeared to run up my staircase at impossible speed, stop right in front of me, and vanish without leaving a single trace behind. And to this day, I still have absolutely no idea what it was. I've always had vivid dreams, but most of them fade from memory within a few hours of waking up. Sometimes I'll remember bits and pieces throughout the day, but eventually they disappear like most dreams do. Every now and then, however, I have a dream that feels different. The details are unusually clear, the emotions are stronger than normal, and when I wake up, the feeling stays with me. This experience happened years ago, and it's one of the few dreams I've never been able to forget. At the time, my best friend and I talked almost every day. We knew each other's families well, spent a lot of time together, and shared pretty much everything going on in our lives. I also knew her boyfriend fairly well because we all hung around the same group of people. One night, I went to bed like any other night. Nothing unusual had happened during the day. There were no conversations about accidents, no discussions about anyone being sick, no reason whatsoever for me to expect the dream that followed. At some point during the night, I found myself standing in what looked like some kind of medical facility. The atmosphere immediately felt serious. The lighting was bright but cold, the way hospitals often feel. Everything around me seemed quiet, almost unnaturally quiet. The kind of silence where you instinctively know something bad has happened before anyone even says a word. Directly in front of me was a stretcher. Lying on the stretcher was a man. I couldn't clearly see his face. For whatever reason, that detail remained hidden from me throughout the dream. What I could see was enough to disturb me. His clothes were dirty. There were signs of injuries. Everything about the scene suggested that something terrible had happened. Even within the dream, I remember feeling a sense of dread. Standing next to the stretcher were my best friend and her boyfriend. Both of them looked devastated. The sadness on their faces felt incredibly real. Not the exaggerated sadness you sometimes see in dreams, but genuine heartbreak. I remember looking from them to the stretcher and back again, trying to understand what was happening. Then, both of them turned toward me. At exactly the same time, they spoke. Their words were simple. Larry died. That was it. Just those two words. Yet hearing them felt like a punch to the chest. The emotional impact was overwhelming. Even now, years later, I can still remember the feeling. The sadness hit me so hard that I actually woke myself up. I sat upright in bed with my heart racing. For several moments, I just stared into the darkness. The dream felt unusually vivid, more vivid than almost any dream I had experienced before. Usually, when I wake from a nightmare, the fear starts fading quickly as reality settles back in. This was different. The feeling lingered. I couldn't shake it. The image of my friend standing beside that stretcher remained crystal clear in my mind. The words echoed over and over. Larry died. The more I thought about it, the more concerned I became. There was only one Larry I immediately associated with my friend, her father. I had known him for years. Because of that, my mind automatically assumed the dream had been about him. I remember feeling increasingly anxious as the morning went on. Part of me knew it was just a dream. After all, people have strange dreams all the time. But another part of me couldn't ignore how real it had felt. The emotional weight of it seemed different somehow. Eventually, I decided I needed to tell her. I picked up the phone and called her. As soon as she answered, I explained everything. I told her about the dream from beginning to end. The stretcher, the injured man, the hospital-like setting, her and her boyfriend standing there, and the words they spoke. I specifically remember telling her to ask her dad not to ride his motorcycle for a few days. Looking back, I know that sounds dramatic, but at the time, it genuinely felt important. I wasn't trying to predict the future. I wasn't claiming to have some supernatural vision. I simply had a strong feeling that I needed to say something. The dream had affected me that deeply. She listened patiently, like most people would. She probably thought it was strange, but didn't seem overly concerned. After all, it was just a dream. Eventually, we moved on to other topics, and life continued. Still, the dream stayed in the back of my mind throughout the day. Every so often, I'd remember it and feel uneasy all over again. The next day started normally. There was no indication that anything unusual was about to happen. Then I received news that completely shocked me. My friend contacted me. The moment we started talking, I could tell something was wrong. Her tone was different, serious upset. Then she told me what had happened. Her boyfriend's best friend had been involved in a terrible accident. His name was Larry. Not her father. A different Larry entirely. According to what she told me, he had crashed his truck. The accident was severe. He suffered devastating injuries and tragically did not survive. For a moment, I honestly didn't know how to respond. I just sat there processing what I was hearing. The name immediately stood out. Larry, the same name from my dream. Then my friend said something that sent chills through my entire body. She reminded me about the dream. She said it was just like what I had described. The moment she said that, I felt my stomach drop. Until then, I had been completely convinced that if the dream meant anything at all, it must have been about her father. That assumption felt obvious. He was the only Larry I connected directly to her. The possibility that it could have referred to someone else never even crossed my mind. Yet here we were, a completely different Larry. Someone connected to her through her boyfriend. Someone I hadn't been thinking about at all. Someone who had unexpectedly died in a vehicle accident less than a day after the dream. I remember feeling a mixture of shock and disbelief. Part of me immediately started searching for logical explanations. Maybe it was a coincidence. After all, coincidences happen. People dream about countless things every night. Sometimes similarities appear afterward simply by chance. That's certainly possible. At the same time, the timing made it difficult to ignore. The dream had been unusually vivid. The emotional impact had been unusually strong. And then, within such a short period of time, news arrived involving someone with the exact same name. For weeks afterward, I couldn't stop thinking about it. Every detail kept replaying in my mind. Why had the face on the stretcher been hidden? Why had I only been given a name? Why had I immediately assumed it was her father? Would I have reacted differently if I had somehow known there was another Larry connected to the situation? The questions seemed endless. Unfortunately, there were no answers. The more I analyzed it, the stranger it felt. If someone had told me the story happened to another person, I probably would have been skeptical. I would have searched for reasonable explanations. I would have pointed out that dreams are often vague and open to interpretation. I still believe that's true. But it's much harder to dismiss something when you're the one who experienced it. What affected me most wasn't the possibility that the dream predicted anything. It was the overwhelming feeling I had upon waking, the certainty that something about the dream mattered, the urgency that pushed me to immediately call my friend. That part felt impossible to explain. Years have passed since then, and I still don't know what to make of it. Maybe it was an extraordinary coincidence. Maybe my subconscious connected pieces of information I wasn't consciously aware of. Maybe it was simply one of those strange events that occasionally happen in life and never receive a satisfying explanation. Whatever the truth is, it remains one of the most unsettling experiences I've ever had. I've had countless dreams since then. Most of them vanished from memory within days. Some disappeared within hours. This one never did. I can still picture the stretcher. I can still remember my friend and her boyfriend standing beside it. I can still hear those words as clearly as if they were spoken yesterday. Larry died. At the time, I believed with absolute certainty that the dream referred to my friend's father. I was wrong. The dream wasn't about the Larry I expected. It was about another Larry entirely. And discovering that fact only a day later scared me more than the dream itself ever did. To this day, whenever conversations turn toward strange coincidences, unexplained experiences, or dreams that seem unusually real, this is the story that immediately comes to mind. Because no matter how many years pass, I still can't fully explain why I had that dream, why it felt so important, or why it turned out to be connected to someone I wasn't even thinking about. All I know is that it happened, and it remains one of the strangest and most unsettling experiences of my life. A few years ago, I returned to my hometown during winter break. It had been a while since I had spent any significant amount of time there, and I was looking forward to seeing family and enjoying a break from the usual routine. Since I was only staying for a few days, I decided to stay at my grandmother's house. The house held a lot of memories for me. I had spent countless weekends and holidays there growing up. Every room felt familiar, from the old furniture to the creaking floors that seemed to make noise no matter how carefully you walked across them. It was one of those places that instantly made me feel like a kid again whenever I visited. At the same time, the house felt different than it used to. My grandfather had passed away about a year and a half earlier. His absence was impossible to ignore. For as long as I could remember, he had been a constant presence in that house. Whether he was sitting in his favorite chair watching television, working on a project in the garage, or sharing stories from years ago, he always seemed to be there. Visiting after his passing felt strange because so many memories of him remained attached to every corner of the home. Even though life had moved forward, there were still reminders of him everywhere. Photographs sat on shelves. Old belongings remained exactly where he had left them. Certain rooms still carried a feeling that he had only stepped away for a moment and would be back at any time. The first couple of days of my visit were completely normal. I spent time with family, caught up on things I had missed, and enjoyed being back in a place that felt familiar. Nothing unusual happened at all. Then came the night that I still think about years later. It was late. I had been out for most of the evening and didn't return to the house until around 11 o'clock at night. Everyone else had already settled in for the evening, and the house was quiet. Outside, winter had wrapped everything in silence. The streets were empty. The neighborhood seemed asleep. Inside, the only sounds were the occasional creaks that old houses naturally make at night. I headed to the guest room where I was staying. The room had changed very little over the years. The furniture was mostly the same, and sitting on the nightstand beside the bed was an old alarm clock that looked like it had been there forever. I didn't pay much attention to it. I tossed a few things onto a chair, changed clothes, and got ready for bed. After a long day, I was exhausted. I climbed into bed, turned off the light, and prepared to fall asleep. That's when it happened. Just as I was settling in, a sound suddenly broke the silence. At first, I wasn't even sure where it was coming from. Then I realized it was the alarm clock sitting on the nightstand beside me. A burst of static filled the room. White noise. The sound was loud enough that it instantly grabbed my attention. I opened my eyes and stared into the darkness. For a second, I assumed the clock radio had somehow turned itself on. Old electronics can malfunction sometimes, especially devices that have been around for years. That explanation made perfect sense. Then I heard something else. A voice. An old man's voice. The words weren't clear. They sounded distant and distorted, as if they were coming through poor radio reception. The voice seemed to be speaking, but I couldn't understand what was being said. It was just a murmur, mixed with static. The moment I realized I was hearing a voice, every bit of sleepiness disappeared. I froze, completely froze. My eyes locked onto the shape of the alarm clock in the darkness. The white noise continued. The voice continued. Quiet, unclear, but definitely there. For several seconds, I couldn't move. My mind raced through possible explanations. Maybe the radio had somehow switched on. Maybe it was picking up a nearby broadcast. Maybe there was interference. Maybe I was hearing something from another room. Yet none of those explanations fully registered because I was too shocked by what was happening. The voice sounded like it belonged to an older man. Immediately, my thoughts drifted toward my grandfather. I didn't consciously make that connection at first. It simply happened. Lying there in the dark, hearing an elderly voice emerge from the direction of an alarm clock in my grandmother's house, it was impossible not to think of him. The experience felt surreal. The static and voice continued for several more seconds. Finally, I forced myself to move. My heart was pounding. Trying to figure out what was happening, I reached over and switched on the lamp beside the bed. Light flooded the room. The alarm clock sat exactly where it had been moments earlier. The white noise was still playing. The voice was still speaking. The room suddenly felt very small. I stared directly at the clock. The first thing I checked was the switch. Like many older clock radios, it had several settings. Radio, alarm, clock, off. I expected to find it switched to the radio setting. Instead, I immediately noticed something strange. The switch appeared to be in the off position. I remember staring at it for a moment because I thought maybe I was looking at it wrong. The static continued. The voice continued. Yet the switch clearly looked like it wasn't set to any active mode. That realization sent a chill through me. At this point, I was no longer lying in bed. I was sitting upright, staring at the clock while trying to understand what I was seeing and hearing. The most logical explanation was still that the device had malfunctioned somehow. Old electronics do strange things. Maybe the switch was broken. Maybe something inside the clock was short-circuiting. Maybe there was a technical reason. Wanting to prove that theory, I decided to unplug it. If it was a malfunctioning clock radio, removing power would immediately stop the sound. Problem solved. I reached toward the back of the nightstand. The voice was still going. The static was still going. My hand searched for the cord. Then I stopped. For a second, I thought I had missed it. I looked behind the clock, then underneath it, then behind the nightstand again. There was no cord plugged into the wall. None. The alarm clock wasn't connected to anything. I remember feeling a wave of cold run through my entire body. The device wasn't plugged in, yet I had just been hearing static and a voice coming from its direction. I stared at it in disbelief. The realization didn't make sense. I knew what I had heard. I wasn't half asleep anymore. I wasn't dreaming. I was fully awake, sitting upright in a brightly lit room. The clock wasn't plugged in. Still, the sounds had been there. Then, almost as suddenly as it had begun, the noise stopped. The room became completely silent again. No static, no voice, nothing, just the ordinary sounds of an old house settling during the night. I sat there for a long time afterward, partly because I was frightened, partly because I was trying to process what had happened. The experience wasn't terrifying in the way horror movies portray fear. I wasn't convinced something evil was in the room. I wasn't expecting objects to move or shadows to appear. Instead, the feeling was something much stranger. It felt deeply personal. As I sat there, my thoughts kept returning to my grandfather. I started remembering conversations we'd had over the years, stories he used to tell, advice he had given me, memories I hadn't thought about in a long time. The more I reflected on the experience, the less frightened I felt. The initial shock remained, of course. Hearing an unexplained voice in the middle of the night isn't exactly an ordinary event, but underneath that shock was a sense of comfort, a sense of connection. Whether that feeling was justified or not, I don't know. I'm fully aware that there could be explanations I simply don't understand. Memory can be imperfect. Old electronics can behave unpredictably. There may be details I overlooked. I'm not claiming to know exactly what happened that night. All I know is what I experienced. I heard static. I heard an elderly voice speaking words I couldn't understand. I found the alarm clock switched off. I discovered it wasn't plugged into the wall. And then the sounds disappeared. The next morning, I checked the clock again. Everything appeared normal. Nothing seemed unusual about it. I even looked more carefully to make sure I hadn't missed the power cord somewhere. I hadn't. The clock remained disconnected. That only made the memory stranger. I considered telling my grandmother immediately, but I wasn't sure how to explain it. Even saying it out loud sounded unbelievable. Eventually, I mentioned it to a few family members. Some thought it was interesting. Others suggested practical explanations. A few simply smiled and said maybe Grandpa was stopping by to say hello. I couldn't argue with any of those possibilities because I honestly didn't know what to believe. What stayed with me wasn't the mystery itself. It was the feeling. For those few seconds, hearing that voice in the darkness felt oddly familiar. Not threatening, not hostile, just familiar. That's why, when I think back on the experience today, I don't remember it as one of the scariest moments of my life. It was certainly unsettling. It was confusing. It was impossible to explain. But more than anything else, it felt meaningful. Part of me still wishes I could have understood what the voice was saying. I've replayed that night in my mind many times over the years, wondering whether there was a message hidden within those distorted words. Unfortunately, the voice was never clear enough for me to make out a single sentence. Just fragments lost beneath static. Whatever was being said remained beyond my understanding. And maybe that's what makes the memory stay with me. Not because I know what happened, but because I don't. To this day, I can't explain why an unplugged alarm clock appeared to come alive in the middle of the night. I can't explain the white noise or the voice that seemed to emerge from nowhere. All I know is that I walked into that room expecting an ordinary night of sleep and ended up experiencing something that I still think about years later. Whether it was coincidence, a strange malfunction, an unexplained event, or something far more personal, I'll probably never know. But every time I remember that winter night in my grandmother's house, I find myself thinking about my grandfather, the voice I couldn't understand, and the strange feeling that, for just a few moments, someone was trying to reach across the silence and say something one last time. Before I had my own house, before I got married and started a family, I spent several winters looking after my parents' property while they escaped the harsh Canadian cold. They lived in a rural area in northern Canada, far enough from town that nights could feel incredibly isolated. Their home sat on a large residential lot surrounded by trees and open land. There was only one neighboring property nearby, and even that house was far enough away that you could go days without seeing another person. During the winter, the isolation felt even more intense. Once the snow arrived, the entire landscape seemed to become quieter. Thick snow covered the ground, muffling sounds and making everything feel still. At night, when the wind died down, the silence could be almost overwhelming. Every year, my parents would leave for Mexico for several months to avoid the long, brutal winter. They had done it for years. Someone needed to keep an eye on the property while they were gone, make sure the house stayed heated, check for any problems, and take care of things until spring arrived. Back then, I was single and didn't have many responsibilities, so I usually volunteered. Most of the time, I enjoyed it. The house was comfortable, and I liked having a place entirely to myself for a while. The dogs provided company, and I appreciated the peace and quiet. It was a nice break from the busier parts of life. Of course, living alone in a remote house also meant dealing with the occasional unsettling moment. Every creak seemed louder. Every strange noise got your attention. If the wind hit the side of the house at night, it could sound like someone walking outside. You learned very quickly that an isolated house has a language of its own. Most noises eventually become familiar. This particular experience happened during one of those winters. It started as a completely ordinary night. I went through my normal routine before bed. I locked the doors, checked the windows, let the dogs outside one final time, and eventually settled in for the evening. The dogs slept in the bedroom with me. That was partly because I enjoyed having them nearby, and partly because they seemed more comfortable that way. They were generally calm animals and rarely caused any trouble. When I finally went to bed, everything felt normal. The house was quiet. The dogs settled down quickly. Outside, the world was frozen and still. At some point during the night, I suddenly woke up. To this day, I don't know what woke me. There wasn't a loud noise. There wasn't a dream that I remember. One moment I was asleep. The next moment I was completely awake. The strange thing was the feeling. Before I even opened my eyes fully, I felt it. An overwhelming sense that something wasn't right. It wasn't fear exactly, at least not at first. It was more like certainty. The certainty that something or someone was inside the house. The feeling hit me immediately. I remember lying there for several seconds, staring into the darkness while trying to figure out why I felt so uneasy. The room itself looked completely normal. Nothing appeared out of place. The dogs were still lying nearby. Everything should have felt safe. Yet the sensation remained. The more awake I became, the stronger it seemed. Eventually, I rolled over and looked at the clock. It was around 3 o'clock in the morning. I don't remember the exact time, but it was somewhere in that range. The house was completely silent. I reached over and turned on the bedside lamp. The light filled the room instantly. Normally, that would have made me feel better. Instead, I immediately felt cold. Not physically cold from the winter weather. The house was heated and comfortable. This was different. A deep shiver ran through my body. The kind of sensation people sometimes get when they feel they're being watched. The bedroom door was closed. I always slept with it closed. Part of it was personal preference. I simply liked having the room closed off at night. The other reason was the dogs. Keeping the doors shut helped keep them in the room, and everyone seemed happier that way. I sat quietly, trying to convince myself that I was imagining things. The feeling persisted. Then, the dogs reacted. One of them lifted its head first. Then, the other. Immediately, I noticed something unusual. Both dogs were focused on the bedroom door. They weren't looking at me. They weren't looking out a window. They were staring directly toward the closed door. I felt my stomach tighten. The dogs weren't nervous animals. In fact, they rarely growled at anything. Even when strangers visited the property, they were generally friendly. Seeing them suddenly become alert was unusual enough. Then came the growling. It started low. A deep rumble from one dog. The second dog joined in almost immediately. The sound filled the room. Every hair on my arms stood up. The dogs slowly moved off the bed and approached the door. Their attention never wavered. Both animals seemed completely focused on something beyond it. When they reached the base of the door, they lowered their heads toward the gap underneath. Then the growling intensified. They stared directly at the narrow crack beneath the door. Whatever had their attention appeared to be on the other side. At that moment, any comfort I had been trying to find disappeared completely. The dogs weren't reacting to some random noise outside. They were reacting to something that seemed to be right outside the bedroom. The growling continued. Then the barking started. Loud, aggressive, relentless. I had never seen them behave that way before. They weren't barking at passing wildlife. They weren't barking at another dog. They acted as though someone was standing directly outside the bedroom door. The sound echoed through the house. I sat frozen on the bed. Part of me wanted to open the door immediately and find out what was there. Another part of me absolutely did not. If someone had somehow entered the house, opening the door seemed like a terrible idea. At the same time, remaining trapped inside the room wasn't exactly comforting either. For several minutes, I simply listened. The barking continued. The dogs remained fixed on the door. Occasionally, they would step back and then rush forward again. Every reaction suggested that something had their complete attention. I glanced toward the clock several times. The situation seemed to go on forever. In reality, it was probably somewhere between 15 and 20 minutes. That may not sound like a long time. But when you're alone in a rural house at 3 in the morning, while 2 dogs bark furiously at a closed bedroom door, 15 minutes feels endless. My imagination worked overtime. Every possible explanation ran through my head. Maybe someone had broken into the house. Maybe an animal had somehow gotten inside. Maybe there was a strange noise somewhere that only the dogs could hear. I desperately wanted one of those explanations to be true. At least those possibilities made sense. What bothered me most was that I couldn't hear anything. No footsteps, no movement, no voices, nothing, just the dogs. Eventually, the barking started to slow down. The growling became less intense. Gradually, both animals seemed to relax. They remained alert, but whatever had captured their attention no longer appeared to be there. The silence that followed felt almost as unsettling as the barking. For several more minutes, I stayed exactly where I was. I wasn't eager to investigate. But eventually, curiosity and practicality won. If there really was something in the house, I needed to know. I took a deep breath and got out of bed. The dogs immediately turned toward me. I walked carefully to the bedroom door. My hand rested on the doorknob for a moment. I remember hesitating. Part of me hoped that opening the door would reveal something obvious. Maybe a raccoon had somehow gotten inside. Maybe a window had blown open. Maybe there would be an explanation waiting for me. I slowly opened the door. Nothing the hallway beyond was empty. No person, no animal, no movement. The house looked exactly as it always did. I stepped out cautiously and began turning on lights, one room at a time. The dogs immediately rushed past me. They moved through the house, searching every corner. I watched them closely. If something had truly been there, I expected them to find it. Instead, they wandered from room to room without discovering anything. No intruder, no wildlife, no evidence of anything unusual. Every door remained locked. Every window appeared secure. The house was completely empty, at least as far as I could tell. After checking the entire place, I eventually returned to the bedroom. The dogs had settled down completely by then. In fact, they seemed perfectly normal. That somehow made the experience even stranger. Only 20 minutes earlier, they had been acting as though something dangerous was standing just outside the door. Now they appeared completely relaxed. I climbed back into bed, but sleep wasn't happening anytime soon. For the rest of the night, I lay awake, replaying everything in my head. The feeling that woke me. The certainty that something was in the house. The way the dogs reacted. The growling, the barking, the complete lack of any explanation afterward. By the time morning arrived, I was exhausted. Daylight made everything feel less threatening, of course. The house looked normal again. The property looked normal. The dogs acted normal. Yet the memory remained. I spent the rest of the winter there without experiencing anything remotely similar. No strange barking episodes. No unexplained feelings. No mysterious disturbances in the middle of the night. Everything returned to normal. That almost makes the experience harder to explain. If it had happened repeatedly, I might have eventually found a pattern or discovered a cause. Instead, it occurred once and never again. Years have passed since then. I've considered every explanation I can think of. Maybe there was an animal outside the bedroom that somehow left before I checked. Maybe the dogs heard something I couldn't hear. Maybe my feeling of unease and the dog's reaction were unrelated coincidences. All of those possibilities make sense. But none of them fully explain why I woke up with such certainty before the dogs reacted, or why both animals seemed convinced that something was standing directly outside the bedroom door. To this day, it's one of the strangest experiences I've ever had. Nothing dramatic ever appeared. No mysterious figure was discovered. No evidence was found. Yet the combination of that overwhelming feeling, the isolation of the house, the time of night, and the dog's behavior created a memory that has stayed with me ever since. Even now, when I think back to those winters alone in that quiet house surrounded by snow and darkness, that night is the one I remember most clearly. Because whatever the explanation was, for about 20 minutes at 3 o'clock in the morning, both the dogs and I were absolutely convinced that something was right outside that bedroom door. If you've stayed with me this far, then these stories didn't simply pass the time. They stayed with you. Everything you heard tonight was real. Real people. Real moments. And in each one, something quietly slipped out of place. If you'd like more of the kind that don't let go so easily, subscribe to Crowvane Manor. There are more rooms left open, and more stories waiting behind every door. I'm grateful you spent this part of your night here. Rest well, and I'll be waiting when you return.